The Commission will come to order. And good afternoon and welcome to our hearing on the escalating violence facing Coptic women and girls in Egypt following the Arab Spring, including the outrageous crime of abduction, forced conversion, and which the Egyptian government, both old and new, is doing all too little about, if anything at all. It has now been almost a year and a half since the revolution began in Egypt, and Egypt is still in the foundry fires of transition, hopefully into a free and democratic state. The Egyptians have elected a parliament, but the Supreme Council of the Armed Forces, or SCAF, dissolved it with the support of the Constitutional Court. As president, Mohammed Morsi of the Muslim Brotherhood was elected and installed, but not before the SCAF, who seemed to be mostly secularist, curtailed presidential power over the military and given the military legislative powers. The constituent panel, which was drawn from the now dissolved parliament and has been boycotted by the Coptic Christians, began drafting work on Egypt's new constitution, yet it may be disbanded any day by a pending court decision. Order seems to hang by a thread, and tensions run extremely high. Though Egypt has avoided civil war, the revolution and ongoing unrest and social conflict has already left many casualties in the Coptic community, which makes up almost 8% of Egypt's population. Sadly, there are groups that would use the ancient Christian Coptic community as a way to build unity around a common enemy. The SCAF was guilty of this on October 9, 2011, when the military fired on a peaceful group of Coptic Christians in Maspero and ran them over with military vehicles while calling through the National News Service for honorable citizens to defend the army against attack. That is, the SCAF openly invited violence against the Coptic community. 27 people were killed and more than 300 injured. Almost all of them were cops. The military claimed that one soldier was killed, but it refuses to release his name. Almost a year later, protesters are on trial for the incident, and 3 soldiers have been charged with only misdemeanors. As we will hear today from Michele Clark in her new report on the disappearance, forced marriages, and forced conversions of Coptic women, the vulnerability and abduction of Coptic Christians is not new. Going back to the 1970s, there were many accounts of Coptic women and girls being abducted by Muslims, forcibly converted, and forcibly married. There are many such reports, no doubt. Some of them were of women choosing to elope, marry across religious lines, and cut off relations with their family. But the claim of the Egyptian government that this is the story of every one of the thousands of disappeared women and girls absolutely defies the evidence. The women and girls who are found claim to have been drugged and kidnapped or kidnapped with violence. They often report human rights abuses, including forced conversion, rape, forced marriages, beatings, and domestic servitude. Alarmingly, since the revolution, cases of reported disappearance have increased, while recovery of the women and girls have decreased. Those women who are found and returned to their families face many obstacles, including government refusals to change their identity cards to reflect their return to their Christian faith, which seems to sanction forced conversions. Nor are we aware of any case before or after the revolution in which an abductor has been prosecuted. President Morsi, in his first speech as president, envisioned Egypt as being for Muslims and Christians. This must mean true justice for Copts. Copts must be given equal protection under the law. Secretary Clinton was in Egypt over the weekend, facing protesters with signs that said, quote, "Obama, don't send your dollars to jihadists." Congress sent the same message with the 2012 Consolidated Appropriations Act, which required the Secretary to certify that Egypt was making improvements in religious freedom before we released the $1.3 billion in aid. An unnamed senior State Department official reported to Reuters that on the basis of American national security interests, she, meaning Secretary Clinton, will waive the legislative conditions related to Egypt's democratic transition allowing for the continued flow of foreign military financing to Egypt. The move reflects, the quote goes on to say, from the unnamed official, the move reflects our overarching goal to maintain our strategic partnership with an Egypt made stronger and more stable by a successful transition to democracy. This is democracy? My response is simply this: unless Coptic women and girls are protected and free to live their lives without fear of abduction, forced conversion, and other gross abuses of their human rights, Egypt will not be strong, will not be stable, or a successful democracy. I'd like to begin now with our first witness. We have, and we thank her for being here today, Dr. Katrina Lantos Swett, who is an expert on human rights. She received her BA in political science from Yale, her JD from the University of California, Hastings College of Law, and her PhD in history from the University of Southern Denmark. She has worked extensively with the U.S. Congress to advocate for human rights, particularly while serving as Deputy Counsel to the Criminal Justice Subcommittee. She teaches human rights and American foreign policy at Tufts University, serves as the President and CEO of the Lantos Foundation for Human Rights and Justice, named after her very distinguished father, who we all deeply miss, and was recently elected as chair of the United States Commission for International Religious Freedom. Dr. Lantos Swett, welcome, and please proceed as you would like.
Thank you so much, Mr. Chairman, and I want to say before I go into my prepared remarks that you are one of the colleagues my father admired most. Literally, one can't number the times that the two of you were in the trenches side by side, battling on behalf of human rights for people in every corner of the world. And my father would often cite you to me and to others as an example of the way in which people who might be in very different places on some political issues could come together and have really no daylight between them on the most fundamental issues of human dignity and human rights. And so it's a real privilege and an honor for me to be here before you today. And thank you for the excellent work that you're doing. My testimony is going to focus more broadly on the challenges and threats to the Coptic community in Egypt. And I know subsequently you'll be getting some very powerful testimony more specifically on the issue of abduction. Thank you for the opportunity to testify today before the Helsinki Commission on the topic of escalating violence against Coptic women and girls. Will the new Egypt be more dangerous than the old? I have been asked today to give an overview about the general status of and conditions for religious freedom in Egypt, especially for Coptic Christians, and I request that my statement be entered into the record. Since its inception nearly 15 years ago, USERF has been deeply engaged on Egypt, and for good reason. For our entire existence, and indeed prior to our creation, religious freedom conditions, including those of Egypt's Coptic population, have been extremely problematic. This situation continues into the present, and with the election of Mohamed Morsi, the first freely elected president of Egypt, on June 30th. The Egyptian transitional government continues to engage in and tolerate systematic, ongoing, and egregious violations of freedom of religious freedom. Discriminatory and repressive laws and policies remain that restrict freedom of thought, conscience, and religion or belief. Given these concerns, and for the second year in a row, USERF recommended in its 2012 annual report, which I have here, by the way, and I'd be delighted to leave with you for the Commission. USERF recommended that Egypt be designated a country of particular concern, or CPC, under the 1998 International Religious Freedom Act. I also request that USERF's 2012 annual report chapter on Egypt be entered into the record. Thank you. From the evidence we have seen, the biggest problem faced by the Copts, who comprise 10 to 15% of Egypt's 80 million people, continues to be one of impunity. Simply stated, for decades, Egypt's government has fostered a climate conducive to acts of violence against Copts and members of other minority communities. It has done so in at least two ways. First, Cairo's long history of restrictive laws and policies, from blasphemy codes to an emergency law, to across-the-board discrimination has drawn unwelcome attention to religious minorities, further marginalizing them and leading to violent words and deeds launched by intolerant individuals as well as by radical religious groups. Second, the government's continued failure to protect innocent people from these attacks and to convict those responsible has served to encourage further assaults. For years, President Mubarak's government tolerated widespread discrimination against religious minorities and disfavored religious groups, from dissident Sunni and Shia Muslims to Baha'is, as well as Copts and other Christians, while allowing state-controlled media and state-funded mosques to deliver incendiary messages against them. The consequences of the climate of impunity are especially apparent in Upper Egypt. After Mubarak's departure, a breakdown in security and a rise in sectarian violence made 2011 one of the worst years for Copts and other minorities. Last year alone, violent sectarian attacks killed approximately 100 people, surpassing the death toll of the previous 10 years combined. As during the Mubarak regime, Copts were the primary target, and most of the perpetrators still have not been brought to justice. Perpetrators have not been convicted, or alleged perpetrators have been detained for short periods, but eventually released without charge. While USERV's 2012 annual report chapter on Egypt includes a list of some of the most tragic acts of violence committed against the Coptic Orthodox community, I do want to note the following significant incident, which you also referred to. Last October, Egypt's state media falsely accused Copts of attacking the military when Muslim and Christian protesters marched toward the state television station. Following the state media's call on civilians to counter this imaginary threat, on October 9th in downtown Cairo, armed men attacked peaceful demonstrators, killing at least 26 of them, most of them Copts, while injuring over 300 more. Responding to the violence, Egypt's military used live ammunition and also deployed armored vehicles that deliberately crushed and killed at least 12 protesters. In addition, reports in recent years support claims that there were cases of Muslim men forcing Coptic Christian women to convert to Islam. The State Department has asserted that such cases are often disputed and include, quote, inflammatory allegations and categorical denials of kidnapping and rape. For example, there were credible cases in which Coptic girls did voluntarily convert to Islam to marry Muslim men, and subsequently, when the relationship failed, sought to return to Christianity, as is their right under international law. Nevertheless, during the reporting period, experts and human rights groups have found that there were also credible cases where Coptic Christian women were lured deceptively into marriages with Muslim men and forced to convert to Islam. According to these reports, if a woman returns or escapes from the marriage and wants to convert back to Christianity, she faces the same legal hurdles in changing her religious affiliation on official identity documents as discussed. In recent years, in response to sectarian violence, Egyptian authorities have conducted, quote, reconciliation sessions between Muslims and Christians as a way of easing tensions and resolving disputes. In some cases, authorities compelled victims to abandon their claims to any legal remedy. USERV has stated that reconciliation efforts should not be used to undermine enforcing the law and punishing perpetrators for wrongdoing. In recent years, the State Department concluded that reconciliation sessions not only, quote, prevented the prosecution of perpetrators of crimes against Copts and precluded their recourse to the judicial system for restitution, but also contributed to a climate of impunity that encouraged further assaults. And how ironic it is that something so benignly termed as a reconciliation process should be used actually to strip people of their legal rights and a means of vindicating those rights. For all Christian groups, government permission is required to build a new church or repair an existing one, and the approval process for church construction is time-consuming and inflexible. Former President Mubarak had the authority to approve applications for new construction of churches. Although most of these applications were submitted more than 5 years ago, the majority have not received a response. Even some permits that have been approved cannot, in fact, be acted upon because of interference by the state security services at both the local and national levels. In 2005, former President Mubarak devolved authority to approve the renovation and reconstruction of churches from the president to the country's governors. Several years later, some churches continue to face delays in the issuance of permits. Even in cases where approval to build or maintain churches has been granted, many Christians complain that local security services have been accused of being complicit in inciting violence against some churches undergoing routine maintenance or repair. In recent years, the government repeatedly has pledged, most recently in October of 2011, to adopt a new law that would apply to all places of worship. In June, after consulting with religious leaders and other experts, the SCAFE released publicly a draft version of the law. The draft was criticized widely by Muslims, Christians, and Egyptian human rights groups. While the subsequent version has not been made public, some reports have indicated that the revised draft law covers only churches and not other places of worship. Now, this is not to say that there has been no progress since the end of the Mubarak regime. To be sure, we have seen some hopeful developments. Last year, the Grand Sheikh at Al-Azhar began several initiatives expressing support for some aspects of freedom of religion or belief. In May of last year, the government began to reopen more than 50 churches that had been closed, in some cases for years. Last July, the Supreme Administrative Court ruled that reconverts to Christianity could obtain new national identity documents indicating their Christianity, but not their former Muslim faith. And following the October violence, the transitional government took steps to reduce discrimination in Egypt's penal code. Yet despite this progress, the bottom line is this: Copts need to be protected. Copts aren't being protected, and Copts must be protected, along with every other member of Egyptian society, from attacks on their right to order their lives and practice their beliefs in dignity and peace. As long as Copts and other religious minorities aren't being sufficiently protected, USCIRF will continue to spotlight the problem and recommend that the U.S. government take strong action in support of religious freedom. Our recommendations to the United States government are as follows. First, the United States should press Egypt to improve religious freedom conditions by repealing discriminatory decrees against religious minorities, removing religion from official identity documents, abolishing blasphemy codes, and passing a unified law for the construction and repair of places of worship. Second, the United States should urge Egypt's government to prosecute government-funded clerics, government officials, or any other individuals who incite violence while disciplining or dismissing government-funded clerics who preach intolerance and hatred. Third, the United States should increase pressure on Egypt to bring to justice those who have committed violence against fellow Egyptians on account of their religion. Fourth, the U.S. Congress should require the Departments of State and Defense to report every 90 days on the Egyptian government's progress pertaining to religious freedom and related rights. Fifth, until genuine progress occurs, USCIRF renews its call for the United States to designate Egypt a country of particular concern as one of the world's most serious religious freedom abusers. Sixth, if Egypt demonstrates a commitment to progress on freedom of religion and related rights, the United States should ensure that a portion of its military aid to Egypt is used to help Egypt's police implement a plan to enhance protection for religious minorities, their places of worship, and places where they congregate. And finally, Washington should press Cairo to ensure that a new constitution has robust protections for the right to freedom of religion or belief, consistent with international human rights law, including recognizing the universal right to the freedom of thought, conscience, and religion or belief for every individual and every religious or belief community. Recognizing that each person's freedom to hold and to manifest any religion or belief, or to not hold any religious belief, should not be limited, aside from the narrow exceptions delineated in international law. 3, affirming that the right to freedom of religion or belief includes the right to have, adopt, or change one's religion or belief without coercion, and to manifest it publicly, as well as to persuade others to change their beliefs or affiliations voluntarily. ensuring that the rights and benefits of citizenship are not limited to individuals belonging to particular religious communities, and ensuring that all persons are equal before the law and are entitled to the equal protection of law, regardless of religion or belief, and that guaranteeing all persons equal and effective protection against discrimination on religious grounds. Today, as Egypt confronts the rigors of democratic transition, will it uphold the rights of Copts and other religious minorities? The world is watching. The Helsinki Commission is watching. And USERF is watching too. Thank you for this opportunity to testify.
Dr. Lantos Swett, thank you so very much for your very eloquent testimony and the large number of recommendations, insights that you and the Commission have provided and have done so since the inception of the Commission. So thank you for, especially as its chair, for taking your tremendous leadership. I do want to note we've been joined by Robert Adderholt, Commissioner Adderholt, and I think it's worth noting and celebrating that at the most recent OSCE Parliamentary Assembly, Mr. Adderholt was elected Vice President of the OSCE PA, so congratulations to you.
Congratulations. Thank you so much.
And if I could just ask a couple of questions.
Of course.
I know you're on a tight... just briefly about one of your recommendations is that Egypt ought to be designated as a country of particular concern. By way of historical reminder, Congressman Frank Wolf's bill, the International Religious Freedom Act, which was vigorously opposed by the State Department. John Shattuck, who was then the Assistant Secretary for Democracy, Labor, and Human Rights, testified before my committee repeatedly against the bill. But one of the geniuses of that legislation was that it established this independent voice to speak truth to power without worrying about the problems that are associated when you talk to dictatorships or authoritarian regimes, which often muzzles our voice as a country, especially on human rights issues, and religious freedom being at the top of that list. You're kind of like the GAO of,
exactly.
of religious freedom.
I like that description.
And you do a wonderful
But we don't go on wild trips to Las Vegas, I'm happy to say.
But, with regards to CPC, if you could maybe elaborate a bit on the frustration that the Commission has had with getting the administration to so designate. It's a two-step. First, designate based on what the record is, and then decide what if of any of the 18 prescribed remedies or penalties that can be meted out to a country, in this case Egypt, might be used. China has been on that list. Unfortunately, we rarely use any of those sanctions that are included. But it's important to first get the designation and then take the second step. What do we do with that designation? Secondly, if I could ask you with regards to, you talked about the reconciliation sessions in your testimony. And while they sound benign and look like, there's something good and wholesome about it, they also carry with it a very dangerous aspect where people who have committed heinous crimes under pressure of a reconciliation session might be allowed to get away with it, whether it be rape or assault. And so what kind of actions are often brought to these reconciliation sessions? And thirdly, if you could, I mentioned in my opening about how hard we worked, Mr. Adderholt, Mr. Wolf, Trent Franks, Kay Granger, who was the key person as chairwoman of the Foreign Ops Appropriations Committee, to put very specific language into the Foreign Ops Bill for this year on religious freedom. It was opposed by the administration. As a matter of fact, it was very vigorously opposed. And yet now it's been waived, just shunted aside as if religious freedom doesn't matter. And when statements are made about strategic partnership with Egypt to make it stronger as a democracy, religious freedom is the first human right. It's at the core of it. If we won't insist upon it, who will? So if you could speak to that very briefly. And then finally, for years, when President Mubarak would come here, I and others would meet with him, and I would bring up two issues every time. The gross abuse of his media to attack Israel and use caricatures and very, very horrible statements about that were anti-Semitic. And the second was the attack on the Coptic Christian community and church. But as you pointed out, there has been a breakdown in security and a rise of sectarian violence that makes 2011 one of the worst years for for Copts and other minorities. What would you recommend we do? Because, we would get a pushback from Mubarak. He'd say, talk to Boutros Ghali here, who was always with him when those issues would come up. And we would give names. We would raise specific instances of violence against Coptic Christians, burning of churches and the like. But he at least was responsive to some. What kind of response are we getting? What would be your recommendation as to, with the SCAF especially and with the president? Are we insisting on it with this administration? Are they insisting on religious freedom and protection for the Copts?
Well, thank you for those excellent questions, and I'll try to address each of them in turn. First, as it relates to the CPC designation, we share your frustration. It was a stroke of genius, I believe, that USCIRF was created as an independent body because we have, if you will, the luxury of being able to have a single-minded focus on our mission, which is the advancement and the promotion of international religious freedom. And as such, frankly, we believe that we see this issue with greater clarity. The State Department is always in the process of weighing various interests, and we understand that that's a necessity given the magnitude of the issues that they have to deal with. And yet, it is our firm conviction that, as you have said so often and so eloquently, religious freedom is a threshold issue. And the implications, the broader implications for a society that fails to provide an environment of robust protection for tolerance, pluralism, and religious freedom are very grave. The evidence is now out there, and it's overwhelming, that the positive correlations for societies that do provide this kind of religious freedom protection are phenomenal. They are more stable. They are more prosperous. The women in those societies have infinitely higher status, infinitely better circumstances. They are more democratic, and of course they are more peaceful. And so this is really not a sidebar issue. I would also say that, as you know, Mr. Chairman, the conduct of a country needs to be egregious and persistent in order to qualify for that CPC designation. And we approach our monitoring function at USCIRF always in a sort of strictly factual way. It's nothing but the facts, ma'am. We go in there looking at what are the facts on the ground, what are the actual circumstances, and then we make our recommendations based on that. And so, all I can say is that we will continue to forcefully advocate with the State Department that they take that next step vis-a-vis Egypt. The facts, we believe, warranted, the circumstances warranted, and I think the evidence is in that countries don't want to be designated as a CPC with good reason. And so, when a country is obviously against their wishes, given this badge of certainly concern, of particular concern, it can serve as a motivation for them to actually get serious about addressing the issues. And as you point out, CPC designation is not an automatic trigger for any particular set of consequences. So that issue can be viewed sort of as part of a separate discussion. What are the appropriate sanctions? But we strongly feel that the CPC designation is warranted. We feel that it is an important tool to hold up for the world to see what the practices are of a country, and it can be a tool for, finally forcing a country to get serious about addressing some of these issues. You brought up the issue of the reconciliation sessions. We have had now over the last several decades societies in which a truth and reconciliation process has played an enormously valuable role in trying to help societies that were riven and torn apart in the most profound ways by war, by apartheid, by decades of sort of saturated abuse in the society, to find a way to move beyond that. And so there are obviously circumstances in which that kind of a process is very, very appropriate. The situation I think we have in Egypt that is of concern is that you are really sort of seeing these reconciliation processes in some instances used not to try and sort of heal the deep societal-wide wounds, but to bully victims into abandoning their pursuit of justice for very specific ills done against them by very specific perpetrators. And that's clearly a perversion and an abuse of a process and sort of putting a very attractive and appealing name on a process, which we feel feeds into the culture of impunity. As you know, in my remarks, I addressed that that's sort of the overarching problem. If we want to put a big tag on what we feel lies at the heart of the religious freedom issues in Egypt, it's this impunity, this culture of impunity created by government policies and by government lack of vindication of the rights of their citizens. And so in that context, this reconciliation process is another piece of that impunity problem. You mentioned the specific language that you had battled so hard to get into the Foreign Operations Bill. And I don't, know that I have huge insight to bring to bear on that. I do know that it is important from the perspective of USCIRF that whether it's the President, whether it's the State Department, we want to see more than inconsequential lip service to the issues of religious freedom. Nobody is going to stand up and speak out against religious freedom, and we can all go to the record and find well-meaning and moving words spoken. But there needs to be more than that. And there needs to be a prioritization of religious freedom. I don't need to tell you, you know better than I do, that religious freedom is really implicated in some of our nation's greatest challenges right now, including some of the national security threats that we face. Again, societies where robust religious freedom is a reality tend not to be societies where the sort of violent religious extremism takes root that can then visit our shores in the form of terrorism and can implicate our national security interests around the globe. So it's not a minor issue. It's not a nice sidebar topic that makes us all feel good and we can kind of, smile and say nice words. This goes to the heart not only of American values, but of American security in the world. And so in that sense, we would obviously be advocating for our State Department and this administration and the Congress to ensure that religious freedom is central to the way we approach our dealings with foreign countries. Finally, it's interesting, the last issue you brought up were your meetings with Mubarak and how you would bring up two issues, the treatment of the Copts and the use of official media to spew out, vitriolic and vile anti-Semitism and Holocaust denial. Just earlier today, and I'm now going to momentarily put on a different hat, as you mentioned, I'm the president of the Lantos Foundation for Human Rights and Justice, and one of our first acts after establishing the foundation following my father's passing was the creation of the Lantos Archives on Anti-Semitism and Holocaust Denial, a collaborative project that we do with the Middle East Media Research Institute. And that archive documents on an annual basis the degree to which so much of the media, the preaching, the teaching, the public discourse in much of the Arabic world, the Muslim world, the Farsi-speaking world is saturated with a degree of overt and vitriolic and hateful anti-Semitism that I really think would make most people's hair stand on end if they were to be exposed to it. And part of what we try to do through the archives is bridge the language gap, because when these examples take place in a language not easily understood, it's easy for it to pass under the radar screen. And so one of the goals of the Lantos Archives is bridge that language gap, bring to the attention of policymakers like you, the media, educators, thought leaders, what's really going on. Because we do believe that shining a bright light on that is at least one step that we can take. But again, the quality of a culture. What is the language that is accepted, that is put forward, that is out there? What are the sorts of slurs against religious communities, against the Copts, against the Jews, that are accepted as just part of the normal discourse? Unless we change the fundamental nature of what is acceptable in these countries around the world, we cannot get at some of the deep intransigent problems that need to be solved for, the peace and stability of the whole world. And so I commend you for raising these issues. I think we need to be more vigilant than ever as we see Egypt and other countries attempting to make a transition to more democratic rule. Democracy can have a big hole in the heart if it is not accompanied by rigorous, vigorous constitutional protections for the sorts of fundamental human rights that we take so for granted in this country. And in that regard, I'll also mention that another initiative that USCIRF has been involved with is a study of constitutional reform processes and trying to provide some help and some insight to many of the countries in the Middle East that are now in the process of drafting new constitutions. And we know that those constitutions won't look exactly like ours, although unlike some people in public life, I think our Constitution is not a bad example to hold up around the world. It's done a pretty good job for this great country for more than 200 years. But democracy must be accompanied by strong and honored constitutional protections for fundamental rights. Otherwise, democracy can easily degenerate into the most dangerous sort of mobocracy.
Dr. Lantos Swett, thank you so very much. I yield to a good friend and colleague, Commissioner Adderholt.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And I'm going to have to slip out shortly, but I do have some questions I'd like to submit. I'd like unanimous consent to submit those for the record. Thank you for being here. Thank you for your testimony.
Thank you.
This issue regarding Coptics has been an issue that I've followed for over a decade now. One thing that I do I would like to get your opinion on and just your thoughts. When it comes to the severity of the issue that we're here discussing today, what do you think are some of the key issues or perceptions that have prevented so many in the international community from understanding really what the problem really is and why they have not acted more strongly on the issue?
Specifically on the issue of religious freedom
and minority women, just in general?
Well, I think that for many years there was sort of this notion that world of religious belief and religious freedom related to kind of an older period in human history, and that as we move forward in the modern world, some of those old notions of what's important fall away. And I think if recent world events have shown us anything, they've shown us how untrue that is. Societies that protect these fundamental rights of belief and conscience, and sometimes those take the form of religious beliefs, but not always. Sometimes that takes the form of the freedom not to believe. Societies that are vigorous in protecting people's ability to express their transcendent views, their views about that which is transcendent in life, in fact are the societies that are best equipped to deal with the many challenges that we face. But I do think that you're right. There has been a certain resistance to embracing the advocacy of these issues, other than in sort of a sidebar rhetorical sense. But as I say, I'm really very encouraged by some of the new, very concrete research and social science evidence that is coming forward to show the correlation and the interrelation between protecting some of these most fundamental rights and building successful, prosperous, stable, tolerant societies. And so, we take some comfort from that and hope that as, in a way, science and faith and practice and tradition come together, there will be a more vigorous community out there ready to stand up in defense of these most fundamental rights. They cannot be ignored. They cannot be set aside. They cannot be dismissed as sort of relics of another era. They are at the heart of how we build a decent and a safe world going forward. And that is certainly central to the mission of USCIRF and something that we're very passionate about.
Thank you. And I just going back to the fact that a lot of people, I think, are not even sure exactly, that's not really focused on some of the human rights issue about what the Coptics are all about and how they, some of the issues that they have to deal with. So, again, I apologize I had to slip out, but like I said, I do have some questions for the record I would like to submit. So thank you very much.
Thank you for your question.
Thank you very much, Commissioner Adderholt. And thank you, Dr. Lantos Swett, for your testimony, your insights and recommendations. And thank you.
Thank you for having me. And thank you for holding this very important hearing.
I'd like to now welcome our second panel to the witness table, beginning first with Michele Clark, an adjunct professor at the George Washington University's Elliott School of International Affairs. She's an internationally renowned expert on human trafficking. Ms. Clark was appointed director of the Anti-Trafficking Assistance Unit at the OSCE in 2005 and developed the groundbreaking publication Working Papers on Combating Trafficking in the OSCE region. She has received multiple awards and fellowships in recognition of her remarkable anti-trafficking work, and just several months ago was here before this commission with some groundbreaking testimony, insights into the abduction of Coptic girls in Egypt, really laid out a challenge for us and especially for the executive branch, and I look forward to hearing what she has found since, and she will explain that, of course, in her testimony. We'll then hear from Dr. Phares, Walid Phares, who is a professor at the National Defense University, and he serves as an advisor to the Anti-Terrorism Caucus and Co-Secretary General for the Transatlantic Legislative Group on Counterterrorism. Dr. Phares frequently testifies before the U.S. Congress, the European Parliament, and the United Nations Security Council on matters pertaining to international security. In addition, he provides expertise for a variety of domestic and international media sources and has published several books, including his most recent, The Coming Revolution, Struggle for Freedom in the Middle East. Then our next witness, and we will just call her Anne, is a victim and needs to maintain anonymity for the safety of her family who are still in Egypt. She's a Coptic Christian woman who recently obtained asylum here in the United States based on an attempted abduction that she endured while in Egypt. I would ask that each of you respect her privacy and not attempt to photograph her, even though she is behind us. We do have Capitol Police on hand to ensure that there are no disturbances. Her words will be translated by Carolyn Doss, who has been here before, and I thank her for that translation. If we could go first to Michele Clark and then to Dr. Phares.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. It's a real honor to be invited to testify once more. Thank you. It's an honor to be invited to testify once more on this important issue of the disappearances, forced conversions, and forced marriages of Coptic women and girls. I'd like to express my thanks to this commission for holding this hearing and for launching our new report. It's a real honor that you've accorded us. I would also like to express my appreciation and my thanks to Dr. John Eibner of Christian Solidarity International for championing the issue and sponsoring the research and writing of this report. I would also like to express my thanks to my co-author, Nadia Ghali, for her invaluable collaboration. She's not able to be with us today. I have submitted written testimony along with the newly released report and would like these to be included in the permanent record of the hearings.
Without objection, your full statement and that of Dr. Walid and all statements will be made a part of the record.
Thank you. My introductory remarks will be brief, highlighting our principal conclusions and recommendations, but I'd also like to address some of the challenges raised by individuals and organizations who would seek to downplay the seriousness of the issue. First, a little bit of context, and then the challenges. This report builds upon our previous work from 2009, in which we documented the disappearances of Coptic women and girls. Many were lured into false relationships through fraudulent means or forcible abductions. These women were coerced into converting to Islam and married to their abductors against their wills. Our report was based on interviews with women who had been abducted, the lawyers who represented them, and family members of women who had not yet returned. But the report was greeted with some mixed response. We're grateful to you and to this commission, which 1 year ago, as you mentioned, sponsored a hearing on this important topic to raise the visibility of violence against the Coptic women in Egypt. Other U.S. government bodies were not so receptive. In 2010, the Office to Combat and Monitor Trafficking in Persons referenced our study in their annual report, although referring to our findings as allegations. Findings of our current report were not referenced in the 2012 TIP report. The 2010 Department of State's International Religious Freedom Report also refers to our work, once again using the word allegation. There have been some interesting traction in other areas, and for the first time we're beginning to see stories in the mainstream media. In 2010, just before the Christmas holidays, the BBC aired a documentary film on attacks against Christian minorities in Europe, featuring a family whose daughter had been abducted. They based their research in large part on our first report. In July 2011, the New York Review of Books featured an article by journalist and writer Yasmin El-Rashdi referencing the disappearance of Coptic girls. And in October 2011, the European Parliament issued a statement condemning violence against the Copts in Egypt and expressed particular concern about girls who have been kidnapped and forced to convert. So we're seeing a little bit of positive response. So why doesn't the issue have more traction? Mr. Adderholt asked a very important question. I'd like to talk about this just a little bit before I get into the finding of the reports. I've been, as you say, in the anti-trafficking world for a long time, and there are many parallels. We know enough now from years of studying recruitment strategies of human traffickers that one main way of luring young women into an exploitative relationship is under the guise of a romantic partnership. We also know that if a marriage is forced, it sets up a controlling and coercive environment which can be nothing short of exploitative. Claims that all disappearances are the results of impulsive behavior reflect a deep and potentially dangerous misunderstanding of the use of force, fraud, and coercion that are characteristics of the relationships between the young Coptic girls and their captors. Both my co-author and Nadia Ghali and I recognize that not all disappearances are the results of abduction, not all marriages are forced. But, and notwithstanding the ambiguity of many situations we encountered, we claim that it's not possible to dismiss each case in our 2009 report on the grounds that girls willingly left their families. We will contend the same thing for the report that we present to you today. These are not all cases of romance gone bad. So concerned with the escalating violence against Copts in Egypt and dissatisfied with the lack of response from the U.S. government, Christian Solidarity International commissioned a second report, which we are launching here today. This new report substantiates our early findings. In addition, we have observed changes in trends and patterns which reinforce the premeditation of the captors. The goal of this report is straightforward: to continue to support the claims of disappearances, abductions, forced conversions, and forced marriages of Coptic women in Egypt, and to continue to challenge the use of the term allegation in U.S. government reports. So how did we get our information? Well, the findings are based on several key factors. First of all, we interviewed 4 Egyptian lawyers who provided us access to claims filed on behalf of Coptic women who had disappeared, as well as young women who had returned from a forced marriage and conversion and were attempting to regain their Christian identities. As we've already heard, the withholding of one's original religion is a repetitive pattern. We also interviewed representatives of civil society organizations. We spoke with family members of young women who have disappeared. Some of these individuals were represented by attorneys. Many cannot afford an attorney and therefore come themselves. We reviewed intranet sites reporting disappearances of Coptic girls, but we considered only those cases with appropriate documentation, especially police reports. And we interviewed women who have returned from forced marriage and conversion. All of our interviews were conducted from November 16th through November 25th, 2011, in and around Cairo, Egypt. Only verifiable cases are included in our report. Each of these cases is verifiable through attorney files, personal interviews, and police reports. The names of young women and their family members and other identifying details are not published to protect their identities. So what did we find that was a little bit different? We went in not quite knowing. We wanted to see if the political climate had changed anything. We wanted to see if the 2 years since our previous report had affected the situation anyway. We noticed some similarities and some marked differences. The first key finding is that the number of disappearances and abductions appear to be increasing. Each of the attorneys that we interviewed for this report indicated an increase in his caseload since January 2011. 4 attorneys collectively report a total of over 550 cases of abductions, disappearances, and petitions to restore Christian identity following abductions, forced marriages, and forced conversions over a 5-year period. Furthermore, one attorney interviewed for this report indicates firsthand knowledge of over 1,600 cases of Christians petitioning to have their conversions to Islam overturned in recent years. 60%, over 900 women, 900 of these cases are women. Data collection, as in the trafficking world, remains a challenge. There is no systematic data repository within the Coptic community documenting the disappearances of young women. Priests or bishops keep records of activities within their churches and communities sometimes. Attorneys maintain their own caseloads. Activists maintain different websites, but there is no cross-referencing with other data sources. Furthermore, families of victims don't report all cases. The police do not register all complaints filed by family members. In many cases, family members of missing young women reported that police would not file a report until a lawyer intervened. In other cases, families don't file reports because they don't believe the claims will be taken seriously or because they fear retribution by the authorities. Not all families are financially able to secure the services of an attorney and will not a guarantee of result, at least the presence of an attorney enables filing of a legitimate claim. We personally spoke to family members who would go to up to 5 or 6 different police stations before some police officer would finally agree to file a claim. These were dismissed for all of the reasons that we've mentioned above. We're also noting that fewer girls appear to be returning to their families. Our 2009 report focused on young women who had returned from forced marriages and conversion and were struggling to regain their Christian identities. They report instances of abuse and forced domestic servitude. One woman reported being prostituted by her captor. Since then, there has been a discernible change in the dynamics of the disappearances of young Coptic women. Attorneys handling such cases report that fewer women are being returned to their families. There is speculation that the young women might be trafficked overseas, but attorneys and activists have not yet been able to document these findings, and we recommend that this trend be followed more seriously. We note that increasingly social media is being used to inform families about their daughters' conversions. One mother we spoke to told us that after looking for up to over 6 months to find news of her daughter, she happened to stumble upon a videotape of her announcing her conversion on a website of new converts to Islam. Another deeply disturbing finding is that minors and mothers of young children are being increasingly targeted. In addition to disappearances of single young women over the age of 18, lawyers report an increase in the abductions of mothers with young children. While the age of consent to convert to a different religion is 18 in Egypt, there are increasing reports that children of mothers who are forced to convert are also subsequently registered as Muslim. Even if a mother returns to her community, the children are considered by law to be Muslim and will remain Muslim. So in forcibly converting one young woman, all of her children will automatically be considered Muslim as well. The disappearances are organized and planned. We've seen this before, but we've received more corroborating evidence. Attorneys, social workers, and members of the clergy interviewed for this and the previous report all attest to the organized and systematic planning in the cases of missing Coptic women. Tactics to lure young women into relationships follow similar patterns. One lawyer interviewed for this report stated that the same man's name occurred in multiple police reports. He married 5 Christian women who subsequently were forced to convert to Islam. So he would marry one, take her away, go back, work on another, get her converted, go back, work on another, and systematically pursue a number of forced conversions. Family members report that their daughters or sisters were befriended by a schoolmate, a neighbor, or another an older mother figure over time. Lawyers indicate that their clients benefited materially. Frequently, family members were provided with new apartments or furniture, and unemployable young men were given jobs among the abductor families. Abductors target vulnerable women and girls in vulnerable and unprotected moments. The concluding observations of the UN's Commission on the Elimination of All Forms of Discrimination of Women for Egypt express concern at the very limited information and statistics provided about vulnerable groups of women in Egypt. Certainly, Coptic women and girls are vulnerable in many ways. They're members of a religious minority. They come from closed, insular communities. Their minority status is the basis for legal and social discrimination. Captors sever contact between victims and their families. The first task of the captor is to come between a young woman and members of her family. They can do this by force, by taking away her phone, by denying her any contact with her relatives. They lock her up. They deny her mobility. They threaten her, telling her that if she runs away, her family will never accept her, that they will punish her, that they will put her into a monastery. Eventually, a young woman is brainwashed and believes that she will be safe only with her Muslim captor. Ultimately, she will be truly safe only if she converts to Islam. There is no obligation for a Christian woman who marries a Muslim man to convert to Islam, so many attorneys claim that this conversion is the ultimate goal of captivity. Captors make use of measures involving force, fraud, and coercion. A young woman consents to a glass of sugarcane juice and the attention of a man whose words promise a life of love, ease, and provision. Another woman shares a drink of water with another mother also waiting for her children after school. A third seeks friendship and escape from a harsh and sometimes abusive home environment. Victims who have not literally been abducted, nevertheless, did not consent to being ripped from their family without ever being able to see them again. They did not consent to being forcibly converted to a religion other than their own. They do not consent to a life of captivity within one small apartment, every outing supervised by a member of her new husband's family. They said yes to the things that young women say yes to. They say yes to friendship, to romance, to hope, a future, safety, and security. It is reasonable to accept that most young women would respond in precisely the same way as many Coptic girls responded to these offers of friendship and romance, which proved to be highly destructive of their own lives. Now, about our recommendations. In developing these recommendations for this report, we consulted with attorneys and civil society actors in Egypt in order to assess what government actions might support their efforts to protect Coptic women from falling into captivity and, as a result, into forced marriages and conversions. There was considerable consensus among those that we spoke to. First, they would request that local police stations will take seriously and file all reports on all claims of disappearance of Coptic women and girls, and that all claims will be investigated and family members kept appraised of the progress of each of these cases. The Egyptian national government will request an annual accounting of all cases of disappearances, including open and ongoing cases, as well as any prosecutions that resulted from these local investigations. The Egyptian government will create a registry to document the disappearance of minors. Children of parents who convert will retain the religion of their birth until they are 18 years old. Laws which penalize discrimination based on religion in the areas of education, employment, and media will be enacted. To the Coptic Church, the activists would like to suggest that the Church maintain a central registry documenting instances of disappearance, abductions, and forced marriages and conversions that is laid out according to a rigorous methodology which can document the instances without sensationalism. The Coptic community will educate families and young women on the recruitment and deception patterns that led to captivity. And for the international community, the recommendations are that a legal defense fund would be created to enable Coptic families to secure the presence of an attorney, which, as we indicated, is frequently the only way to get a case legally registered as a disappearance. International or national agencies assessing the situation of Coptic women in Egypt will recognize that coercion and fraud are represented in most cases of disappearance, forced marriages, and forced conversion, all of which obviate the consent of the victim. And finally, the recommendation that ended my last testimony to you, Mr. Chairman, that international organizations and our own government will recognize both the scope and the scale of the problem and no longer refer to such cases as allegations. I don't think that anyone will refer to the witness we will hear later as an allegation. Mr. Chairman and members of the Commission, I thank you for your time and interest in this very important matter. I look forward to answering your questions.
Ms. Clark, thank you so very much for your incisive testimony, for undertaking this extraordinary human rights project to report, to investigate, and for doing it yourself. Thank you so much for the bravery that surely exhibits. Dr. Phares, please proceed.
Thank you. Mr. Chairman, members of the Commission, I would like to thank you very much for extending this invitation to me to address this very dramatic issue of persecution and of abduction of girls and women in the Coptic community in Egypt. I have titled my paper, my presentation, as "The Strategy of Subduing a Community by Terrorizing Its Women." And thank you, Mr. Chairman, for including the full text of my testimony in the records. What I would like to do for the sake of time is to summarize the following. First, from a strategic perspective, what are the findings of our colleagues this year and last year in this body, in Congress, and also in the European Parliament, if I may, have been telling us? What are the major points that we can respond to? From there, I'd like to ask 5 questions and answer them that would allow the Commission and therefore members of Congress and our government in general terms to respond to the challenge. The violence against Coptic women in Egypt, as many experts have already testified before this prestigious forum over the past few years and last year in particular, these acts of violence against Egyptian Coptic women, both individually and collectively, have been unrelenting, repetitive, and directed almost exclusively at young single women and who are at age of marriage or just about. This violence, which is described in several reports already submitted to your Commission, to Congress in general, to other legislative bodies around the world, can be summarized as follows. A, the attacks have been ongoing for more than 3 decades, with peaks in some years. B, the victims have primarily been young Christian women. C, Egyptian security and judicial authorities have not helped, in general terms, the families of these girls and have not actually conducted an investigation, a thorough national investigation of who is that network in Egypt that basically has been perpetuating those attacks for the last 5 years at least, documented. D, an overwhelming majority of the kidnappings and violence have been carried out by individuals and groups who claim to be acting on their ideology, on behalf of their ideology, a doctrine, a set of fundamental beliefs known as Salafism or jihadism, which they claim is the strict implementation of Sharia laws. C, an overwhelming majority of these crimes have been dismissed by government security and justice institutions, and the radical factions have been protecting many of these perpetrators, assigning essentially blame to the female victims and their families. F, violence against young Christian women in Egypt has continued after the downfall of the previous regime and the formation of the current alternative government and its institutions. These findings, Mr. Chairman, prompt the following questions, 5 of them. A, have the attacks been widespread and consistent over time? so that we can deal with the argument of this is just a reaction to a love affair or a social situation gone bad? Is the history of these attacks reflective of the legal and security status of the Coptic Christian community at large? 2, is the violence committed by an organized movement or by individuals who claim to be acting on behalf of an ideological movement? 3, does the attitude of government, security, judicial, and political institutions reflect cooperation with the attackers or just neglect for the protection of a segment of Egyptian society? 4, what are the consequences of the continuous attacks against Coptic females and thus the Coptic community despite the regime change, of government change, and the rise of new institutions in Egypt, which I feel is a key element in our discussion today? And 5, what can and should the United States government, specifically the administration, do to put an end to these violent practices against the women of Christian Coptic community? Answering those questions, or attempting to do so, will equip members of the Commission and thus of Congress with the perspective needed to understand the exact nature of the crisis and make informed recommendations regarding possible new legislation and alternative policies for adoption by the executive branch. Point number 1, the nature of these attacks. According to prior research submitted to your Commission and to other congressional committees, targeted attacks against Coptic Christian women are not unrelated and isolated acts of violence. On the contrary, kidnapping and forcing captive women to convert to Islam has been documented for decades, revealing hundreds of victims each year. Research and Coptic sources claim that the violence against Coptic women has been practiced since even before the rise of modern Egypt. But current research is confirming that this abuse was documented for at least the last half a decade or decade, especially in the last 5 or 3 years. Therefore, the first characteristic of the crisis is its long-standing history. This means that any solution to the problem must address its historical roots and scope of the violence. This violence against Coptic females took place before and after the Arab Spring, before and after 9/11, before and after the end of the Cold War, and before and after World War II. We are dealing with a threat that has the dimension of an attitude by either a movement or an ideology with regard to the Coptic community. Now, with regard to the perpetrators. While research over the past 5 years, I must admit, has not revealed a well-designed structure that openly and officially takes responsibility for these attacks against Coptic Christian women, it has shown, however, patterns and statements that indicate the existence of a movement that hails from a well-publicized ideology, namely Salafist, namely Islamic fundamentalist, or also known as jihadism. In almost all cases, Mr. Chairman, the kidnappers argued that their actions were legitimized and inspired by Salafist and jihadist principles. One central tenet that most of my colleagues have mentioned already this year and last year, one central tenet of those principles is that individuals, in this case females, who convert from Christianity to Islam cannot revert back to their original religion, must accept their quote-unquote forced marriages, and in some cases families of the victims were asked to pay a tribute to recover the daughters. The reference to jihadist views applicable to Christian Copts in general and women and girls in particular shows that the acts perpetrated against them and their communities are ideologically and politically motivated. Government failure and collaboration. We also detected that, based on reports by human rights groups as well as Coptic community and liberal Egyptian NGOs, that local Egyptian police and security forces, national security agencies, including the now gone state security agency Amn al-Dawla, are or were either covering up the attacks or protecting the perpetrators. Therefore, when we look at the historical timeline of security collaboration with the perpetrators, or at a minimum, non-support to the victims and their families, this coincides as well with a timeline of similar aggressive behavior against the community as a whole. Coptic activists and NGOs, including the Washington, D.C.-based Coptic Solidarity International, have accused Egyptian security services under the Mubarak regime of using Salafists to conduct attacks against Coptic targets to maintain the community under the protection of the government. Coptic and liberal Egyptian NGOs have argued that the new security agencies formed after the collapse of the Mubarak regime, after the latest legislative elections, continue to allow these practices or help the perpetrators. Consequences of attacks against Coptic women, which I consider one of the most important key analysis in our discussion. If the aggression targeting Christian Coptic women continues and widens, without a determined and aggressive intervention by the Egyptian government to put an end to this practice, there will be serious consequences on Egyptian Christian women, their own communities, the Christian Coptic community, but also on Egyptian women in general, leading to a weakening of civil society and a dramatic setback to freedom, to human rights, and democracy in Egypt. The chief consequence of unchecked aggressions against Coptic women and the terror is basically the terror it is instilling in the hearts of Christian women who count for at least half of the 15 or so million Christian Copts in Egypt. The hundreds of repetitive attacks against Coptic women send a clear signal to millions of young women in Egypt who feel targeted by the jihadists and Salafists, compelling them to limit their movement, to narrow their social circles, and to separate from Muslim communities. So violence against Coptic women leads to a de facto gender apartheid in Egypt, where Christian women will be increasingly deterred from finding jobs, from expressing their opinion, from wearing their own preferred outfits and circulating in public spaces. The effects on Coptic women will also extend to the entire Christian community, as half of its members are increasingly intimidated by acts of violence committed on hundreds of young women. When one segment of community is terrorized, it reverberates throughout their families and communities, forcing the collective into mental ghettos and therefore emigration. Rape, abduction, and forced conversion are among the root causes of a general sentiment among Copts that pushes thousands of them to flee the country of their ancestors. Outside the community, the attacks against Coptic Christian women and their results will bring other consequences, Mr. Chairman, to bear on secular Egyptian women in general, meaning Muslim secular Egyptian women in general, both liberal and conservative. By failing to protect its Coptic citizens, the Egyptian government would be perceived as incapable of protecting other segments of the population also targeted by the Salafists and the jihadists. Muslim liberal and secular women who already fear the strict implementation and enforcement of the jihadi-viewed Sharia law will be under increased pressures by the most extreme elements of the Islamist movement to wear the hijab and later the full niqab. The attacks on defenseless Coptic women are a mere prelude to a wider campaign to impose its ideological agenda, clearly seen in the Salafist movement as early as 2011. The role of the U.S. government, finally. The United States government has an international responsibility in addressing the situation in the same way our U.S. foreign policy has addressed mass-scale abuse of human rights around the globe for the last 20 to 30 years. We recommend for the Helsinki Commission to adopt the following steps as a way to help protect Coptic women and girls in Egypt from abuse and defend their universal rights. 1. Reaffirm the conditions on global U.S. foreign aid to Egypt, despite all the debate that has been taking place in Washington about it, of a constitutional provision announced by the drafters of the new Egyptian constitution, that the practices of abducting, torturing, and forcing conversions on Coptic women or any element of society is a terrorist act which is punishable by law. This is not an infringement of their liberties, it's a terrorist act. Kidnapping in Colombia is a terrorist act. Kidnapping in any part of the world is a terrorist act. 2, make a congressional declaration that crimes against Coptic women inspired by extremist ideologies targeting communities will be considered crimes against humanity punishable under international law. There are no differences between rape and aggression against women in Egypt and what happened in Yugoslavia or in Bosnia or in Kosovo. 3, partner with Coptic and civil society NGOs, extending financial support directly to these entities as part of the global US aid to Egypt. If you want to send foreign aid to Egypt, if you want to send hundreds of millions of dollars, we also need to earmark part of that aid to the NGOs that are representative of the weakest elements of the Egyptian society, that will be women and minorities. 4, ensure that the educational and informational system in Egypt, particularly state-supported institutions, which we are funding, by the way, isn't used to propagate the ideology and precepts used by the perpetrators of the attacks as a way to legitimize violence and discrimination against Coptic women and encourage acts of violence against them. Mr. Chairman, what happened in the classroom in Egypt is the beginning of the process of the development of a radical educational and also cultural policy that ends up convincing the perpetrators that what they are doing is the right thing to do. So we need to also be sure that educational and informational system in Egypt are reformed, are adapted to international standards of human rights. And last, number 5, is to conduct an international investigation. It could be US-led, and I'm sure that the European governments would be very interested in joining, but an international investigation of this mass abuse of human rights that is targeting a segment of an Egyptian society. Because we cannot rely on the Egyptian justice system at this point in time. We could help that justice system. We could equip them with advisors. We could begin by sending a commission to Egypt to begin that investigation. I would end by saying that the current situation in Egypt presents us with a historic opportunity. Now that elections have taken place, now that a president has been elected, it is very important to our administration, to our executive power, to engage in a discussion, in an open discussion, not in a discreet discussion. The perpetrators in Egypt must know from the media, from public discussion, that our officials are demanding from the president of Egypt, are demanding from the future elected or the current parliament that these issues would be at the table, that the constitutional committee that is looking at the future constitution will take consideration these elements. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you, members.
Dr. Phares, thank you very much for your extensive testimony and your leadership for so long on these issues. I'd like to now ask a woman who has been victimized by abduction. As I indicated earlier, recently got asylum here in the United States. And as we all know, getting asylum is no easy business. There needs to be proof. An administrative law judge needs to be convinced. There's a whole process that needs to be followed. Her information seems to be absolutely credible. So we welcome her to the commission and ask her if she would now proceed.
أنا مسيحية من اسكندرية في مصر. أنا يوم 5 يناير 2011.
I am a Coptic Christian from Egypt, from Alexandria, and on January 5th, 2011,
كنت عند مامتي وكنت على حوالي الساعة 7 بعد الظهر.
I was at my mother's and it was about 7 p.m. at night.
كنت نازلة ومروحة بيتي ومعايا بنتي وشايلاها، هي كانت نايمة كنت شايلاها وجيت.
I had left my mother's home and I was carrying my daughter because she was asleep.
كنت بركب ميكروباص عشان خاطر مروحة بيتي، وأنا بركب الميكروباص وعلى أول درجة لقيت مرة واحدة نفسي وقعت على ظهري.
I was getting onto a microbus, and when I had taken the first step, I felt myself falling backwards onto my back.
أنا ما كنتش عارفة إيه اللي بيحصل، في إيه، مش قادرة أستوعب في إيه، غير إن لقيت واحد عمال بيحاول يرفعني من الأرض.
I didn't know what was going on. All I felt that someone was picking me up off the ground.
وبيقول لي أنا كنت بقول له أنت مين؟ أنت عايز إيه؟ كان بيقول لي تعالي أنت هتركبي هنا هوت في التاكس.
I was asking him, what do you want? What are you doing? And he said, you're coming with me. You're going to get into this taxi.
كنتش عارفة أعمل إيه. كانت بنتي كنت بحاول أمسكها على قد ما بقدر عشان خاطر ما تقعش مني.
I didn't know what to do. I was just trying to hold on to my daughter because I was afraid she would fall.
كان بيحاول يرفعني من على الأرض وفي نفس الوقت كنت انا عماله بدور وزعق حد يشوف مين ده، انا ما اعرفوش، حد يشوفه، انا ما اعرفش مين ده عايز مني ايه.
I was screaming. I didn't know what he wanted. I had no idea why he was doing this.
الناس ابتدت تبص تشوف، بس هو راح قال لهم محدش ليه دعوه، هي عدوة الاسلام، محدش ليه دعوه، كله يبعد بعيد.
People started to look and wondering what was happening, and he just started yelling, "This is no one's concern. She's an enemy of Islam. This is no one's concern. She's an enemy of Islam."
كلهم ابتدوا يقفوا يتفرجوا، هم مش عارفين، انا مش عارفه اعمل ايه، عماله احاول ان انا اقاوم. ابتدى يرفعني من على الارض، وفي نفس الوقت لغايه ما وصلت لغايه التاكسي.
I didn't know what to do. He was dragging me, and people were just watching. And then he got me to the taxi.
كان بيحاول يزقني في التاكس من رقبتي، يعني ماسك رقبتي من ورا، عمال يزق فيا عشان خاطر اخش جوه التاكسي، وانا كنت عماله بحاول بقدر الامكان ان انا اقاوم.
He kept trying to shove me into the taxi by holding me from the back of my head. I kept trying to resist and push back, but he just kept trying to shove me into the taxi by holding me from the back of the neck.
في الوقت اللي هو كان بيحاول اللي هو يزقني في جوه التاكسي وانا كنت بقاوم، بنتي مره واحده اتخبطت في عينيها، في عينيها اليمين، في البوز بتاع باب التاكسي.
As he was trying to shove me into the car, my daughter's eye hit the corner of the door of the taxi.
انا ما كنتش عارفه اعمل ايه. انا لقيتها مره واحده بتعيط، وفي نفس الوقت عايزه اقاوم، خايفه، مش عارفه، مش لاقيه حد يساعدني، مش لاقيه اي حاجه، لغايه ما
I didn't know what to do. She was screaming. I didn't know how to fight back. I wasn't sure what I should do.
كل مره واحده لقيت كان في راجل شغال في العماره بتاعتنا، هو حارس للعماره. لقيته مره واحده جه وراح ضربه وراح شدني بعيد عنه، وابتدى هو يتخانق معاه.
Suddenly, the guard from my mother's building started hitting him, and he pulled me away from him.
الراجل راح جري، دخل جوه العربية وراح وجري بالتاكسي. كان في واحد كان سايق، فراح دخل بسرعة ودخل وطلع يجري. وكان الراجل ده كان مهتم جدا، اللي هو الحارس، اللي هو يمسكني، اللي هو يشوف أنا عاملة إيه، اللي هو يرجعني تاني للبيت.
The guy jumped into the taxi. There was a driver in there, and they drove away. The man who helped me was only concerned about helping me and taking care of me.
خدني للبيت تاني. كنت طبعا في حالة مش قادرة، منهارة، بعيط، بنتي بتعيط، مش قادرة أتخيل إيه اللي حصل، وليه، وأنا عمل ليه كل دوت، إيه اللي حصل.
He took me back to the home. I was crying. I couldn't process what had just happened. I couldn't understand why did this happen? What just happened to me?
بنتي كانت بتعيط، لقيت مرة واحدة ببص في عينيها، لقيتها عينيها ابتدت تورم وابتدت تحمر.
My daughter was crying. I looked and I noticed that her eye was red and it started to swell.
في نفس الوقت كان عم ويليام، الراجل اللي هو كان موجود اللي هو خدني وأنقذني، رن على بابايا في الانتركم وقال له ينزل. نزلوا بسرعة هو وماما، ولقوني طبعا في حالة منهارة جدا، مش عارفة.
The man who saved me hit the intercom button and called my parents down. My parents came down and saw me in a hysterical state.
اتصل بابا أول ما جه، أول ما شافني راح كلم جوزي على طول وراح قال له يجي بسرعة. جوزي جه بسرعة، خدنا ورحنا على المستشفى.
He called my husband and told him to come immediately. He came and he took us both to the hospital.
خدنا ورحنا على المستشفى. دخلنا في الامرجنسي وقالوا لنا ما تقلقوش، لأن هي الجرح بسيط، هو سطحي، وادونا شوية أدوية وقطرة وروحنا البيت.
When we got to the emergency room, they told us not to worry, it was just a superficial injury, and they gave us some medication to treat the injury. And then we started home.
وأنا في طريقي للبيت أنا كنت حامل في الشهر التاني، وأنا في الطريق ابتديت أحس بألم جامد جدا في بطني، ابتديت أحس بحاجة زي نزيف.
On the way home, I started to feel terrible pain. I was in my 2nd month of pregnancy, and I started to feel like I was bleeding.
ماما ساعتها اتصلت على طول بالدكتور وقالت له، راح قال لها خليها تيجي بسرعة على العيادة.
My mother contacted the doctor and he told her to have me come to the clinic immediately.
ماما خدت بنتي وروحت على البيت، ابتديت أنا وبابا وجوزي طلعنا بسرعة على العيادة.
My mother took my daughter home and my father, my husband and I went directly to the clinic.
وساعتها الدكتور قال اللي حصل miscarriage وأنا لازم أعمل عملية لأني خلاص ما في أنا فقدت البيبي خلاص.
The doctor there informed me that I had miscarried and I had to perform a procedure to remove the baby.
عملت العملية وبعد كده رجعت على البيت مع بابايا ومع جوزي.
They performed the procedure for me, and after that I returned home with my father and my husband.
بنتي كانت في حالة نفسية فظيعة جدا، صعبة جدا، كانت في حالة رعب. أنا كنت في حالة رعب، كنت خايفة أنزل، خايفة من أي حاجة، خايفة أنزل الشارع، خايفة حتى من الباب، من جرس الباب لمجرد اللي هو يرن. كنت عايشة في حالة من الرعب مش قادرة يعني.
I was in a very bad emotional state, as was my daughter. I was terrified from everything. I was afraid to leave the house. I was even afraid to hear the doorbell ring.
كنت بقعد أتخيل لو كان الراجل الحارس دوت ما جاش وأنقذني، كان إيه اللي هيحصل لي؟ كان إيه هيبقى مكاني دلوقتي؟ كان إيه اللي هيحصل لبنتي؟
I kept asking myself, what if this man hadn't saved me? Where would I be now? What would have happened to my daughter?
كنت لغاية دلوقتي كل ما افتكر الموضوع ده ببقى مش عارفة، بشكر ربنا إن أنا قدرت اللي هو أنقذني من حاجة زي كده. بس في ناس كتير ما بيحصلش، يعني بيروحوا وما بيقدروش يرجعوا تاني.
Until today, when I think about it, I thank God that I was saved. But then I wonder about the others that weren't saved. What happened to them?
أنا جيت النهاردة عشان أقدر أساعد ناس كتير بتعاني حاجة أنا شفتها وحسيت بيها، وحسيت قد إيه حاجة ممكن بتموت، مش واحد مش بيقدر يتخيلها. قد إيه ناس ديت مش يعني إزاي بيعانوا من كل دي، يعني بيعانوا من حاجات، من اللي هم ممكن يتقتلوا، ممكن يغتصبوهم، ممكن يبعدوا بنتي عني، ممكن يبعدوني عن جوزي، يبعدوني عن أهلي، يبعدوني عن بابايا ومامتي.
I try and imagine, what about those people? What about the others, the other victims? I'm here today, so I can tell you what happened to me. I try and imagine and think, where would I be? Where would my daughter be? Would I ever have seen my husband again, my family again?
أنا نفسي أعمل حاجة، نفسي إحنا عايشين في مصر، بنلاقي اضطهادات كتير ومشاكل كتير، بنحاول إن إحنا نعيش بيها، لكن
we live in Egypt and we experience a lot of persecution, but we try and live with it.
لكن القتل، الخطف، دي حاجات صعبة.
But the deaths and the kidnappings, that is too difficult to bear.
إن الطفل يعيش من غير مامته، إن أم تعيش من غير ابنها، إيه ذنبهم؟ ذنبهم إن هم مسيحيين،
For a child to live without a mother or a mother to live without her child, what did they do? What did they do to deserve this?
ليه يبعدوا؟ إيه اللي كان هيحصل لبابايا ومامتي وجوزي؟ إيه موقفهم؟ هما بياخدوا الستات لأن هما عارفين قد إيه إن دي حاجة مكسفة، إن اللي الست تسيب بيتها يقولوا دي سابت بيتها وراحت وجوزت واحد مسلم.
What would have happened to my father? What would have happened to my husband? They take women because they know the shame that it will bring to the family.
إزاي هما هيعيشوا؟
How can they survive?
Thank you.
Thank you very much for bravely coming here and telling us of what is an absolutely gut-wrenching and terrible experience. And I think you helped to bring, for all of us, what it was like to be in the beginning stages of an abduction. We know others who have been abducted for long periods of time. Michele Clark has spoken about that, especially in previous testimonies. So thank you so much for your courageous witness before this commission today. I would like to ask a few questions of our witnesses, beginning first with Dr. Phares. The name of your testimony, the headline, the title, The Strategy of Subduing a Community by Terrorizing Its Women. We just heard a terrorized woman talk about how being a victim has the potential of bringing shame to herself and to the family, which I think is precisely and the absolutely wrong way of looking at it, but that be it may as it may. I would argue, and I know you would agree, that this kind of terrible targeting of women, terrorizing women, brings shame not only to those who engage in this barbaric behavior, but also those who enable it by indifference, by their silence, by their looking askance, looking the other way. And I want to ask you, and I mean this very sincerely, and I hope if you have information, I will write a letter asking if this was brought up. Before I get to that, after our first hearing, when Michele Clark testified and told us it is no longer a case of saying these are allegations, but these are facts on the ground that women are being abducted, they are being forced into marriages, they are being abused. This is a despicable treatment of women, and it's not just an allegation. It needs to be really combated. And if it needs more chronicling, certainly the United States government has the capabilities, the wherewithal, and the knowledge as to how to do it. In direct response to that testimony, Congressman Frank Wolf put your statements, Ms. Clark, in the hands of Ann Patterson, who was actually meeting with him right upstairs in this office, his office, and I put it in the hands of Michael Posner, the Assistant Secretary for Democracy, Human Rights, and Labor. I would ask you, if you could, do you have any knowledge as to whether or not Assistant Secretary Michael Posner has done anything with this damaging information? I would point out, for the record, so there's absolute clarity on this, when we had a phone video conference with Ann Patterson, I asked her directly, with others sitting there listening, as to whether or not she had acted upon this terrible human rights abuse being meted out on women in Egypt, and whether or not we had deployed Foreign Service officers, the human rights person in the embassy, to follow up and to look into this and do their own report. You've gone to Egypt, Ms. Clark. You took time out of your schedule to do this. We have people on the ground who are eminently capable and knowledgeable and know how to do this kind of reporting. And Ms. Patterson told me, Ambassador Patterson, no, she had not gotten around to it. And we had a very spirited exchange. I asked her to do it. To date, I know of no investigation undertaken by the U.S. Embassy in Cairo. Added to that, we just had our Secretary of State, Hillary Rodham Clinton, meet with the President of Egypt. And I'm wondering if any of you can tell us, or if we have any reason to believe, that the Secretary of State has raised this issue anywhere at any time. And specifically, has she raised it with the SCAF? Has she raised it with the President of Egypt? Do you have any information on that?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I read the transcript of the hearing in which you spoke to Secretary Posner. I was not able to be at that hearing on November 16th last year because I was actually getting on a plane going to Egypt that very afternoon, so I remember the date. What I can say is that no one from his office has contacted me to find out, or the co-author of this report, to find out information about our cases. The cases have been disputed. The cases, people have gone publicly on record saying that no one has been able to substantiate these cases, that they are inflammatory, they contain inflammatory allegations, but without substantiation. The only way they could be substantiated is by asking me who's involved, because the identities have not been published, and no one has approached me from Mr. Secretary Posner's office to ask me about follow-up on the report.
Mr. Chairman, I would like first of all to take the opportunity to thank you for what you do for the community and for engaging the community, not just in inviting witnesses to testify in front of this prestigious committee, but actually for yourself, for the second or third year, to go to the community, to their leadership, and engaging them, sitting with them hours and hours, and yourself acting as an investigator of the human rights abuses of the community. That is the example that we in the world of NGOs would like to see you and your colleagues, and also the State Department and the administration engaging. And the term engagement has been used by the administration for the last 4 years repetitively. But unfortunately, among the recipients of the engagee, we didn't see representatives of the Copts. We saw many delegations from the Muslim Brotherhood before and after the Arab Spring. We are now seeing possibly Salafist delegations heading to the State Department or to the embassy, or maybe beyond that, but we haven't seen delegations from the Coptic leadership going or being invited actually to our administration and being asked about that issue. My esteemed colleague mentioned the issue of alleged. I mean, in international law, if one incident is alleged, if 20 incidents are alleged, if 500 incidents over 5 years are alleged, then what is alleged at the end of the day? To answer more specifically your question about do we know about any discussions that took place between the Secretary and the President of Egypt, well, what we have is open resources and open sources, and also the responses from the NGO, the Coptic NGOs. The issue of the Coptic community as such, and I would like to take advantage also of my time to mention the direction of the narrative of the administration, which is very important, and that could help the narrative of Congress. When we talk about religious freedom, we put all our efforts to make sure that the religious freedom basically is the freedom of a religious community. It's not just to go to church on Sunday. It is not that hour and a half or 3 hours from home to church and back. Unfortunately, the narrative that we've heard over the past 3 years, and significantly this year, is that religious freedom is now being perceived by the executive branch as freedom to practice faith individually. That is not religious freedom, because you may well go to church while the entire community is suppressed or driven to jails or even outside the country. What needs to be done is a rediscussion, first in Congress and then in dialogue with the administration, that the Coptic community has to be recognized as a community. These are not just individual Egyptians who happen to be Christian and who are struggling to go every Sunday and pray at church, which means that this community basically has to be received, has to be basically recognized in the same way we receive representatives from the Kurds of Iraq, or from the people of Darfur, or from the Palestinians for that matter, or even from East Timor. This is a community that has rights. It happened that it is Christian. In Bosnia they were Muslims. In other places they are parts of different religions. So unless we see a change in the narrative of the administration that would recognize the Copts as a community, that would start to receive them at the highest level of our government as such and listen to their issues, I don't think that there is a recognition of the problem that exists as a collective problem in Egypt, unfortunately.
Thank you, and I'd like to really support what my colleague has said. In the early days of the anti-trafficking community, as you know so well, the State Department required a minimum number of cases. A country would be put on the TIP report only if a minimum number of cases were proven. It makes sense. You don't want to issue a scathing report based on allegations. These were provided, countries were rated. I know this because I was involved in designing several of the methodologies used to count these numbers. What are we waiting for in this particular area? How many more young women will it take who come and say they endured a miscarriage because they were wrenched into a bus with their baby whose eye is wounded next to a car holding on to the mother? The instances of Copts seeking asylum since the collapse of the Mubarak regime has escalated, including a large number of women on these same claims. So we're seeing one aspect of our government that is recognizing the truth of these instances. Our immigration courts are saying, yes, that you were almost abducted, that you returned from an abducted situation, that you fear abduction. These are reasons for granting asylum. I think it's time to create a bit of harmony in this, in our policy in this area. I was a witness myself in a federal immigration hearing a year ago for asylum on the basis of fear of abduction, and that in that case it was also awarded. So enough is enough, really. How many more times do we have to sit here and bring voices and bring stories and talk about parents who agonize? Imagine as a parent, your daughter doesn't come home from work, you don't see her for 2 months, 3 months, 9 months, you hear nothing. And maybe if you're lucky, you'll then you'll see her face covered in a veil announcing her conversion in muffled terms on a YouTube video. But worse, maybe you'll hear nothing. Absolutely nothing. The silence now, the abductions, the disappearance followed by nothing is so disturbing, because something is happening to those young women. All right, they haven't been raptured, they haven't disappeared into thin air. Something has happened to them. What? We need to find out. We need to require an accounting. We need to know how many there are, and we need to start investigating what is happening to these disappeared women.
I should make a note for the record at this point. We had invited Assistant Secretary Jeffrey Feltman from the administration to come here to take questions and to give testimony, of course, but apparently they chose not to come. I would say for the record as well, and we will reissue the request, and that would include Assistant Secretary Michael Posner to come and give an accounting. It's not like we have, and especially the women who are being victimized have been impatient. This information was physically, I actually put it in his hands, so it wasn't sent by courier or anything else, and we still have had no response, which I find appalling. If not the United States, who? Thankfully, the European Parliament has shown even more interest than the United States government has, and I think that's unfortunate. We should both be equally interested when women are being exploited and abused in such a horrific way. You noted, Ms. Clark, in your statement that the number of disappearances and abductions appear to be increasing, and just 4 attorneys, as you point out, collectively report a total of 550 cases of abductions, disappearances, and petitions to restore Christian identity following abductions, forced marriages, and forced conversions over a 5-year period. 4 lawyers, and I'm sure there are hundreds, if not thousands of lawyers, but certainly hundreds who would have vital knowledge of this issue. do you have any sense yet as to the scope of this grotesque human rights abuse? And secondly, with regards to this, where is the UN? You know, the Egypt is a signatory since 1982 of the International Covenant for Civil and Political Rights. Article 8 of that makes it very clear. It forbids slavery and servitude. Forced marriage certainly falls under the rubric of that. So my question would be, you know, where, I know, you know, there was a periodic review back in, I think it was 2010, but at any time, any country can bring, and we are members in good standing of the Human Rights Council, can bring an action before the Human Rights Council to engage a debate and an investigation. To the best of my knowledge, the United States has said nothing. I'm not sure if the European members who were part of that commission have said anything, but it would seem to me that would be an avenue to raise this grotesque violation of women's rights in Egypt, which is the equivalent of rape. When you abduct somebody, force them into a marriage, by any other definition, that is rape. And we need. Why have we been so silent? But if you could speak to that issue, there was a couple of questions.
Thank you, Mr. Smith. There's an increase. The challenge, as I mentioned in my testimony, of data collection are manifold. For two reasons. The authorities are most of the time unwilling to file a disappearance report. If a Coptic father relative goes to a police station in the district where after a daughter disappeared or was abducted, many times that parent gets, or family member gets the runaround. Well, go here, or well, we don't know, maybe she's just run away. Again, why are you reporting her? She probably went off with her boyfriend. And so often the only way a Coptic family can file a case of disappearance or abduction is if they have a lawyer. Because many of the disappearances and abductions take place in rural communities or communities where individuals have less disposable income, they can't afford a lawyer. And many of the attorneys that we spoke to actually take many of these cases completely pro bono, and it ends up becoming a major part of their caseload. So they're very heroic in that they put in a great deal of long hours to take these cases. So, which is why one of our recommendations was to try to enable some kind of legal defense fund among the civil society actors to help make sure that the lawyers are compensated and continue to go on making their living. So scope, it's very hard pressed if 5 lawyers are saying that they are seeing over 100 cases a year, and these are 4 lawyers, it can go anywhere. I know some people are partial to extrapolation. I tend to be wary of extrapolation. It's a lot. It's a lot. Perhaps Dr. Phares has more understanding understands more. And the UN, no. We were able to, in researching this second report, we looked high and low for evidence that the UN, the Commission on Elimination of Discrimination against all forms of discrimination against women, whether they were doing anything. No, we have not been able to find any references among the UN or agencies directed towards the Coptic issue.
So the panel of experts that seeks to implement and admonish countries at CEDAW only makes that vague comment that you put into
yes, that was
they have done nothing more than that.
Nothing more than that we have been able to find.
Let me ask you, your trend lines are important, and again, number of disappearance and abductions increasing, fewer girls appear to be returning, and you know, with every statement you've made, disappearances are organized and planned. The trend line is bad and getting worse. What do you think it will take for the United States government and for other governments, and hopefully Islamic countries, and especially the country of Egypt, the government of Egypt, to understand the outrage and the shame and dishonor this terrible human rights abuse brings to Egypt? How do you shout out loud enough to say, these women are being abducted. What if it was your daughter or your sister or your mother?
The calls for justice need to come, and they need to come louder. It needs to be brought up by our embassy in Egypt. There has to be an accounting.
Have they brought this up?
To my knowledge, I think you and I are on the same page as far as what we know. Dr. Phares, would you?
Yes, Mr. Chairman, thank you for asking this question. I would insist again on the fact that the administration or any administration should change direction in dealing with the Coptic issue. This is not about individual problems with other individual, perpetrators. This is an issue of a community. Before the Arab Spring in Egypt, the Egyptian government of Mr. Mubarak, our ally, despite repetitive demands by the Congress to look into the issue, their representative in the Human Rights Council in Switzerland has been blocking those issues. Now, we need to come to President Morsi, the democratically elected president of Egypt, and ask him to instruct his own representative, his own ambassador in Geneva at the council to actually raise the issue. We want the Egyptian government themselves to raise the issue so that we would basically come and help them. But more important, as my colleague has mentioned, there should be actual physical legal acts on our behalf and on behalf of the international community. We can certainly write to the Arab League. You, Mr. Chairman, mentioned the issue of shaming them. Well, they are members of the Arab League. And when the Arab League took a decision to have an intervention, a collective intervention in Libya because of abuse of human rights, Egypt voted for. So now, yes, we would like to send a letter, Congress could, the administration should, to the Arab League to look into the issue. And we could go higher than that, as you just mentioned, to the Organization of the Islamic Conference. These are institutions with whom we have relationship. The administration has an ambassador, basically, that goes to the Organization of the Islamic Conference. We should enable that ambassador to go and talk about this specific issue. Egypt is a member of the OIC. So we need to engage in a dialogue with the administration to convince them to use every tool at their powers. It's not just a discrete discussion between a Secretary of State and the President. It should be an open issue. And last, if I may say, if it comes to that level, our embassy should simply grant visas to the victims and bring them to Congress, and our European counterparts should bring them to the European Parliament, make it into a public debate, a public issue. That would basically put a lot of pressure on the government of Egypt.
Michele, Ms. Clark, you mentioned in your testimony that mothers with young children are increasingly targeted for abduction, and we heard from the victim just a few moments ago when she said, what would happen to my daughter if the abductor had succeeded? My question to you is this a new trend, or are we just getting more information on that? What happens to those children? Are they compelled to become Muslim as well?
Yes, they are. If the mother is forcibly converted, then all children take on the dominant religion, which is Islam. So when we were there on our last trip, we spoke to a number of families where the children were caught between two worlds, because the families were continuing to, in cases where mothers had been able to come back, where the children, or if the mother is abducted, even if the children are not with her, the children are still converted automatically, according to practice. So the children are caught between two worlds, because they are from a Christian community, but their documents would indicate that they have been converted because of the conversion of one parent. And so they become trapped.
Let me...
Yes, but yes, the trend is more. We encountered a greater number of families where abductions actually included a mother and several children, or targeting a family. A mother was abducted on her way to Cairo to visit her mother in the hospital, and then this woman's daughter was at the same time being lured in through a fraudulent relationship away from her studies at a university, and so the whole family was targeted in different locations. It was actually very strategic, to use Dr. Phares' words. There was a plan behind this to literally co-opt the entire family.
Let me ask you, Dr. Phares, you talk so strongly about violence against women, which this is, and terrorizing women. Have any of the women's organizations taken a stand in favor of Coptic Christian women and spoken out?
Mr. Chairman, to my knowledge, from public narrative, posted or printed, we haven't seen significant statements or policy papers issued by prominent national organizations dealing with women's issues both in the United States or dealing with those issues abroad. There have been mention, of course, of these issues, but we haven't seen, for example, major NGOs dealing with women raising the issue of persecution of Coptic women. And if I may take advantage of the answer to mention that the third branch of our government, I have testified for the last 18 years to many courts, like you have, dealing with political asylum. Judges' first question to us, to most of the experts who are dealing with the Coptic issue and with other persecutions as well, is there a country condition? It's not just about the person. Are you testifying on that person or on a country condition? And they would not grant permission. They would not grant political asylum unless the expert would explain to them that, of course, the community is persecuted. So you have with you the third branch logical question about this issue, so that we could communicate this to the executive branch.
Do imams countenance this and affirm or in any way embrace this abuse of women?
In Egypt, regarding the position of the clergy, one must recognize that the highest authorities in Al-Azhar have had several positions condemning any act of violence. The problem is that we would like them to see condemning the network that is perpetrating these acts of violence. And we've seen this across the Middle East. Islamist authorities have been, candid enough to condemn terrorism or to condemn acts of violence against minorities, should it be in Syria or in Lebanon or in Egypt, and specifically in Egypt. What we need them to see, to direct themselves to, is to condemn the actual networks that are conducting this and the actual ideology that the networks are using in perpetrating their acts.
Let me just ask our victim, who again, we're so grateful she's here, all of us, I'm sure even the panel feels the same way. Before you were abducted, did you have any fears of abduction? Is abduction something that is discussed among your friends? And have any of your friends had any similar experiences?
قبل موضوع الخطف بتاعي احنا بنواجه مشاكل كتير، بنتشتم في الشارع، بيتف علينا، في مية نار بتترش على البنات في الشارع. انا ما حصليش مية نار، بس في ناس كتير ترش عليها مية نار.
Before this attempted kidnapping, many times we would be spit on in the street, cursed at, acid water sometimes thrown on women. It hasn't happened to me, but it's happened to others.
كنا بنحاول ان احنا يعني بنعيش في كده، بنتغاضى، يعني بنعدي الحاجات اللي بتحصل ديت، خايفين ننزل الشارع. احداث كتير كانت حصلت في الكنايس. انا كنت بخاف بعد احداث كنيسة القديسين، انا كنت بخاف اودي بنتي الحضانة بتاعتها في الكنيسة، خايفة اللي هي تروح الكنيسة بيحصل اي حاجة، اي مشكلة.
I was afraid. Even after the event, after the Saints Church, I was even afraid to take my daughter to preschool.
كنا عايشين خايفين على أولادنا، خايفين من في آخر سنتين كان في حاجات كتير بتحصل، إحنا ورا بعضيها.
We're afraid for ourselves, we're afraid for our children. In the last 2 years, a lot of bad things have been happening right after one another.
Let me just ask our panelists if they have any final closing comments that they would like to make. I would note that the recommendation for, or the suggestion of a letter to the OIC, I think is an excellent one, and to others. We will undertake that in follow-up. I plan on doing a follow-up letter to the Secretary of State asking what, how often, where has this barbaric practice and the effort to combat it been raised with the Secretary of State and others. So I do hope that's a good news story, that this has been robustly engaged and they're fighting back. And that would include with the SCAF, whether or not, you know, they are ever focused on, you know, the economic, or I should say the military aid, $1.3 billion, which is a huge amount of money. And it seems to me that they need to be engaged even at least equally with the President. I would ask you if you might want to comment whether or not an amendment requiring or linking the government's efforts to combat this egregious practice and linking it to the $1.3 billion that goes to Egypt would be a wise decision in a foreign ops bill. Yes, we know that the administration, as they did with the religious freedom part, could simply waive it, and I hope they wouldn't. In good faith, I hope they would not waive it, or perhaps deduct a portion of the aid as a penalty. If there's no penalty, and if it's not even being brought up, why do we expect any kind of positive movement? And so on the amendment issue, if you might want to touch on that, and then any concluding comments that you might have.
Thank you. Again, I'd like to thank you, Mr. Smith, for holding this hearing, and Christian Solidarity International for being so persistent and publishing not one but two reports to make sure that the information is brought to those who are decision makers. Women need to be able to pick up their children from school without fear of being abducted. Young girls need to be able to go out and have cups of coffee with their friends without fearing that the brother lurking in the background is perhaps going to be raping them. Young women need to be able to come and go and have lives without looking over their shoulder 24 hours a day, wondering if they're going to end up forced into a taxi, thrust into Al-Azhar to be forcibly converted, married to someone that has deceived them about the nature of the relationship, and living in a coerced situation as a domestic servant or potentially trafficked outside of their own country. To not address this issue is to saying that we don't care, and that we cannot say. So should there be an amendment to the foreign aid bill? Absolutely, because we're talking about one of the rights that is just so fundamental to all of us here as Americans. It's at the heart of what our country is. Because of fear of abduction, they now feel that these women feel they have no movement. They can't come and go. The parameters of their daily lives are increasingly entrenched around survival and safety. This is no way to live. The suffering of parents who haven't heard from their daughters for months and years, and the silence continues, is no way for a family to live. The sense of marginalization of the young children who were converted because their mother was forced into conversion and live in a no man's land of not being accepted by their own communities, that's not a way for anybody to live. Mr. Smith, it's time that we require acknowledgement of this issue as a bona fide violation of human rights, as a violation of religious freedom, as a cruel instance of exploitation against women, as a case of human trafficking, and something that must end. Thank you.
Mr. Chairman, I am for an amendment that would link foreign aid to Egypt to the human rights abuses, and a clear measurement of these human rights abuses, and the behavior with Christian women in Egypt should be part of this measurement. However, we could help the State Department and the executive branch by suggesting that they would organize a conference here in Washington, D.C., so that the American public, who is basically funding this foreign aid at the end of the day, can hear and see directly from the victims and from all other political parties in Egypt. Namely, I would like to see a conference that would invite the Muslim Brotherhood, the Salafists, those who in Egypt are claiming that persecution does not exist on the one hand, and Coptic and women and other minorities, NGOs, under the auspices of the State Department, to just have C-SPAN and have the American public realizing what is the real relationship and what are the problems. And last, I would like to also make a recommendation for our foreign policy when we meet with President Morsi to make sure that he understands that the United States do consider those issues as part of international law, as part of our international commitment. Lately, President Morsi, in order to make us feel comfortable in the international community and make those communities feel comfortable, said that he would be willing to appoint a vice president who would be a Copt, another vice president who would be a woman. Well, the response came from the Coptic community a few weeks ago from Coptic Solidarity International Convention in Washington. They actually told President Morsi, thank you for your suggestion. We don't want anybody to be appointed. We would like to elect our representative and serve as your vice president. So let's see what his response is going to be. And thank you very much for inviting me.
And for the final word, the woman who bravely has come here to testify about her ordeal.
آخر حاجة أنا كان نفسي إن أنا أروح أعمل محضر اللي أنا أقدر أخد بيه اللي عمل حاجة زي كده ده يتعاقب، لكن أنا ما قدرتش إن أنا أروح أعمل محضر لأني بابايا قال لي، بابايا هو محامي وقال لي أنتي لو عملتي محضر الموضوع هيروح أمن دولة وإحنا اللي هنتبهدل، هما مش هيجيبوا لي حقي.
The last thing is I wish I could have filed the police report. But my father advised me, who's an attorney, that if we go, we won't get any of our rights. And in all likelihood, we would be transferred to Egyptian state security.
And thank you.
Thank you. Thank you all for your tremendous witness, and the Commission will follow up. Thank you for the many recommendations. The hearing is adjourned.